Last night, President Biden delivered a dark warning about the state of the world. During a Democratic fundraiser, he said that the world hasn't been this close to nuclear Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The disturbing assessment comes as Vladimir Putin and his allies continue to dangle the prospect of nuclear war in Ukraine. Last week, the Russian-backed Chechen leader casually urged Putin to use low-yield nuclear weapons in Ukraine after weeks of Russian defeats and protests at home. Senior Biden administration officials continue to say that Russia's nuclear posture hasn't changed. Biden's comments, while terrifying, come as Russian forces continue to suffer losses in the south and the east. Just yesterday, Ukrainian forces recaptured 6 settlements in the Russian-occupied Kherson region. The Russian-installed puppet leader of that region posted a 4-minute video message criticizing, quote, generals and ministers for their failures and suggested that President Vladimir Putin's close friend and defense minister should consider killing himself. Yes, he was that specific. In yet another public humiliation, 2 Russians fleeing their country to avoid military service landed their boat on a small Alaskan island and requested asylum in the United States. Sarah Palin could see them from her house. Thousands of Russian men have fled the country since Putin called up 300,000 of them for military service. According to the Washington Post, a member of Putin's inner circle voiced disagreement directly to the Russian president in recent weeks over his handling of the war. Late this afternoon, Ukrainian authorities discovered yet another mass grave containing 180 bodies near the recently recaptured town of Lyman in eastern Ukraine. Back with me is former CIA Director John Brennan, and joining me is Nayyera, former senior State Department advisor and former White House senior director under President Obama. Nayyera, I will start with you on this. The last time I heard somebody in their 70s talk about Armageddon, it was Steven Tyler telling me to not close my eyes and I didn't want to miss a thing. When the President of the United States uses those kinds of terms, how dangerous is that for allies and other people in the world to hear? That's not we're in danger. He literally hearkened back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is that something that the White House and other spokespersons are going to need to walk back? Or is it something that they want to stand behind him in order to encourage people to see how dangerous this war is?
Yeah, I'm still shocked, Jason, that we are now living with the threat of nuclear war. And I thought this was something that boomers were supposed to already have solved for us, among other things. But the threat of mutually assured destruction is actually a doctrine of nuclear deterrence, meaning it's a reminder that if you launch a nuclear weapon, someone is likely to retaliate, and that is bad for everybody. And even though you have these massive stockpiles in the United States and Russia, China, India, also nuclear powers, the idea of what can happen as a result of that first use is the problem. And that is what President Biden is reminding not just the country and us. He is reminding Putin directly. This is a message to him. There are very limited channels right now for the United States to diplomatically speak to the Russian government. This was a pretty obvious way to remind Putin that there are risks involved with his discussion and continual raising of the use of nuclear weapons, something actually he has done and tried to normalize since he invaded Ukraine.
Former Director Brennan, this is the thing that also strikes me. Putin's rattling his sabers over the use of nuclear weapons. As a practical matter, how does that in any shape, way, or form align with what his stated goals are? Putin's goals were to denazify the Ukraine, were to liberate the Ukrainians, liberate Russians who were being trapped in Ukraine and couldn't leave, couldn't get back to their home country. How do nuclear weapons even assist in that goal? Or is he just saying that as a way to sort of threaten and bully the rest of NATO to stay out of the conflict?
Well, Jason, it really doesn't help his goals. If his quest is to bring Ukraine into the Russian orbit, he's destroying a lot of Ukraine. And a tactical nuclear weapon certainly would do more along those lines. But it's quite clear that Russia has suffered major setbacks and losses in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are on a roll right now. And so therefore, the concern, I think, that President Biden is now stating is that Putin, as he increasingly sees this, I think, as an existential threat to his own survival in terms of president of Russia, might he opt for something such as a tactical nuclear weapon, and as was just pointed out by Nayyera, that has the potential to escalate rapidly. And so we're all hoping that still he's not going to go down that nuclear route. But I think we cannot be dismissive, because he may, in fact, opt for some of these tactics that are not going to advance his military objectives, but he's going to do it as a way, certainly after the saber rattling, to try to reverse course and reverse his fortunes on that battlefield.
Jason, I want to jump in on the back of what John just said and talking about the tactical nukes. That's a very key thing here, because those are the short-range, very localized targeting that Putin has the ability to impact Ukraine directly without necessarily having it spread to NATO allies or even necessarily the United States. And that goes against what the United States has been trying to do all along, which is to contain the war in Ukraine. We have provided billions upon billions of dollars of military aid and support to the Ukrainians, but we have not given them enough to go and take the war to Russia and really have this be about the United States going up against Russia. We wanted to contain it. The idea of a nuclear weapon being used, even in that small, limited capacity as such a nuclear weapon can be, does bring up that threat that other people will get involved in trying to contain the problem.
So, Nayyera, I want to actually follow up on this, because you're talking about, hey, we want to keep the war contained to this particular space. We're hoping that the goal is to help Ukraine sort of recapture territory that has been taken, not for them necessarily, take the war all the way into downtown Moscow. But what I'm also seeing, what I'm curious to hear from both of you on this actually, is what is the role that the sort of domestic strife in Russia is also playing in what Putin is saying right now and how President Biden is responding? You've got protests in the street of Russia right now. People don't want to do this. You've got soldiers fleeing. You've got examples. We've got reports now of Russian soldiers in a panic, and in some cases, Ukrainian residents saying they're hiding Russian soldiers in their homes who don't want to fight this war. With the war being as unpopular as it is back home in Russia, will the domestic strife perhaps lead to Putin backing up? First Nayyera, and then former Director Brennan.
Well, that's some of the logic behind even the sanctions regime, right, is to tighten the grip, isolate Russia enough from the rest of the world that there's an economic impact. But the people are the ones who face that economic impact. The oligarchs have still been able to largely get out of the country, even if they've lost access to their yachts and fancy homes in Miami. But the challenge that we end up seeing is that Russia's fell prey to Putin's propaganda, right? Largely controls the media space. The Catholic Church also aligned, rather the Orthodox Church aligned with Putin in favor of this continued invasion of Ukraine. So we were seeing numbers like 70% of the population supported this until they had to send their children off to war, right? So that is where, when you start seeing drafts implemented, and we saw this in the United States, imperial ambitions get checked. I would venture to guess that if the United States had a draft rather than a all-volunteer army, as we do right now, we would have seen something different play out in Iraq and Afghanistan as well.
And former Director Brennan, how do you think the sort of domestic strife and pushback and the jailing of opposition activists and everything else like that that's being heightened now in Russia, how do you think that is going to impact, or could it impact, Putin's rhetoric and the continuation of this war?
Well, unfortunately, Jason, Putin doesn't seem to be affected much by the anti-war sentiment that is rising in Russia. And I do think it's going to create some additional problems for him. He is much more sensitive to criticism from his right wing, those who are advocating a much stronger push in Ukraine and encouraging him to adopt stronger tactics, to include using tactical nuclear weapons. Putin doesn't like being perceived as weak, and I am concerned that those right-wing advocates of war in Ukraine are the ones that have his ear and may be pushing him in a direction to double down. I do hope that there's going to be the anti-war activists in Russia that are going to continue to let their voices be heard as a way to try to get some type of rational decision-making in the Kremlin, which has been absent up until now.
Director John Brennan and Nayyera, thank you so much for joining us on The Readout tonight.